The February wind lashed Margaret Hartley and her 7 children like a harsh slap across their weary faces, as if their hardships were not enough. The children, ranging from 14-year-old Rose to 6-month-old Samuel, were wrapped in a torn shawl draped across her chest. In front of them stood her brother-in-law, Howard Hartley, his face as cold, sullen, and unfriendly as the Alaskan winter. "You've been here 6 months, Margaret," Howard said in a heartless voice. "After Thomas died, who looks after their sister-in-law for 6 months? Continuing this is charity work. This is much more than most widows whose husbands lost their lives in mining accidents. Mining accidents aren't my problem. Sorry." Hearing this, Margaret, with what little life she had left, felt as if she had lost them too, and was shocked. As if her husband hadn't died because of the company's negligence. As if Thomas hadn't spent 15 years of his life working in his brother Howard's gold mine. And as if, while describing the 6 months as a burden, she didn't know that women weren't allowed to work in the mine, that all the work belonged to men, that there was no way for a woman to earn money to feed 7 children. "It's 30 below zero," Margaret said quietly, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her throat. "Where exactly do you expect us to go?" Howard shrugged, already turning back toward his horse. "That's not my concern. The company house is needed for working men. You should have remarried by now. Plenty of miners need wives. Your pride's kept you alone, and that's your own fault." Pride. Margaret almost laughed at the word. It wasn't pride that had kept her from accepting the marriage proposal of men who looked at her 7 children as burdens to be disposed of, who made it clear that only she would be welcome in their bed and their home. It wasn't pride that made her refuse to abandon her own flesh and blood for the security of a roof and food. Their few possessions were already piled in the snow outside: a cast iron pot, 2 threadbare blankets, the clothes they wore, and a small bundle of Thomas's things that Margaret couldn't bear to leave behind. It was everything they owned in the world, and it would fit in a single grain sack. Howard mounted his horse without looking back. "You've got until I'm out of sight, then I'm locking the door." He rode away down the frozen track, his broad back a symbol of every injustice Margaret had ever suffered at the hands of men who held power over the powerless. Rose, her eldest, moved to Margaret's side. At 14, she was trying to be the woman of the family, her thin face set with determination that couldn't quite hide the terror in her eyes. "Mama, where will we go?" Margaret looked at her children, Rose trying so hard to be brave. 12-year-old James, his father's face staring back at her. 10-year-old Catherine and 8-year-old William, twins who clung to each other like they always did when frightened. 6-year-old Emma, too young to understand they were being thrown out into a winter that could kill them in hours. 4-year-old Michael, already shivering despite his layers, and baby Samuel, mercifully asleep against her chest, unaware that his mother had no plan, no hope, no answer to Rose's question. "We'll find shelter," Margaret said, with more confidence than she felt. "Gather everything. We're leaving." They walked. There was nothing else to do. The town of Greystone was a mining settlement of 300 souls, built around Howard's gold operation. Every building belonged to the company, every job was controlled by Howard, and every person knew better than to cross him. Margaret had tried, in the desperate weeks after Thomas died, to find work or charity. The mine superintendent's wife had offered her laundry work for food, but Howard had shut that down with a single word. The pastor had looked sympathetic but done nothing. The other miners' wives had their own families to worry about and couldn't risk Howard's displeasure. So they walked, following the frozen track that led away from Greystone toward what Margaret didn't know. The nearest settlement was 40 miles away, an impossible distance with 7 children in February. But staying meant dying, either from exposure or from Howard's indifference. So forward was the only direction that mattered. The cold was beyond anything Margaret had words for. It wasn't just cold, it was a living thing that wanted to devour them, that crept through every layer of clothing and stole the warmth from their bodies breath by breath. The children's faces were already red and raw, their breath coming in small gasps. Michael started crying after the first mile, a thin, hopeless sound that broke Margaret's heart. Emma fell in the snow and couldn't get up, her little legs too weak. James picked her up and carried her, stumbling under her weight. They had to stop every few hundred yards to huddle together, sharing what little warmth they could generate. Margaret knew they wouldn't last the night in the open. The temperature was dropping as afternoon faded toward evening, and the sky was that peculiar gray that promised more snow. They needed shelter. They needed it soon. It was Rose who remembered. "Mama," she said, her voice shaking, "what about the ghost train?" Margaret's blood went cold, and it had nothing to do with the weather. The ghost train. Everyone in Greystone knew the story, though few dared speak of it aloud. 10 years ago, a gold transport train had been carrying a fortune in refined ore south through the mountains. Something had gone wrong. Accounts varied on whether it was sabotage, mechanical failure, or the judgment of God, but the result was the same. The train had jumped the tracks on a steep curve, and one of the cargo cars had tumbled down the mountainside, crashing into a ravine 2 miles from the rails. 3 men had been in that car. Their bodies were never recovered. The railroad company had tried to salvage the car and its contents, but the terrain was too treacherous, and winter had set in before they could mount a proper expedition. By spring, the decision had been made to write off the loss rather than risk more lives. The cargo car had been left where it fell, and over the years it had passed into legend. They called it the ghost train because of the sounds. People claimed you could hear metal screaming in the night, a howling that didn't sound like wind. They said the spirits of the dead men walked the ravine, forever trying to complete their final journey. But worse than the ghosts was the creature. For the past 10 years, trappers and hunters had reported sightings of an enormous white wolf in the mountains around the crash site, a she-wolf bigger than any natural animal, with a coat like new snow and eyes that gleamed with intelligence. Some said she was the spirit of the mountain drawn by the violence of the crash. Others claimed she was the guardian of the dead, protecting their resting place from the living. What everyone agreed on was that the ghost wolf was real and she was deadly. Two men had ventured too close to the ravine 5 years ago, looking to salvage metal from the train car. Only one had made it back, babbling about white fur and teeth like knives and a howl that shook his bones. He'd left Greystone within a week and never returned. Since then, no one had gone near the ghost train. It was cursed ground, everyone said. Death waited there. Margaret looked at her children, at their blue-tinged lips and shaking bodies, and made her decision. Death waited everywhere in Alaska in February. At least the train car would have walls and a roof. How far? She asked Rose. 2 miles into the mountain, maybe 3, Rose said. The trappers say you can see it from Eagle Ridge. 3 miles. Might as well have been 300, but it was their only chance. We go, Margaret said. Now before we lose the light. The climb was agony. The track that led toward the mountains wasn't maintained. No one had reason to use it, and the snow was knee-deep in place. Margaret carried Samuel, who had woken and started crying, a thin wail that tore at her heart. James carried Emma until he couldn't anymore, and then Margaret somehow carried both, though her arms screamed with the effort. Rose and Catherine supported William and Mike, the 4 of them lurching forward like a single wounded creature. The light was failing when they reached Eagle Ridge. Margaret's vision swam with exhaustion and hypothermia, but she forced herself to look where Rose was pointing. There in the ravine below was a shape that didn't belong to nature. The cargo car lay on its side, half buried in snow, the dark metal standing out against the white landscape. It looked like a coffin, an iron coffin big enough for 8 souls. Getting down to it was a nightmare of slipping and sliding, of catching children before they tumbled, of praying the snow would hold and not give way to a rock slide. Margaret fell twice, protecting Samuel with her body, feeling the impact through her bones. But somehow, impossibly, they reached the bottom of the ravine. The train car was larger than Margaret had imagined, perhaps 30 feet long and 10 feet wide, lying on its side like a dead beast. One end was crumpled where it had struck the rocks, but the other end looked intact. The door, now facing upward like a hatch, was sealed shut, or perhaps frozen. Margaret approached it with the caution of someone approaching a wild animal's den, because in a sense that's exactly what she was doing. She heard it then, the sound that had kept everyone away for 10 years, a low metallic moaning that rose and fell with the wind, punctuated by sharp screeches like metal and metal. It sounded like something in pain, something angry. It sounded like a warning. But Margaret was past the point of heeding warnings. She planted her feet in the snow, gripped the door handle with both hands, and pulled. It didn't budge. She pulled again, putting her back into it, feeling her muscles tear with the effort. Rose joined her, then James, the 3 of them pulling together while the younger children huddled nearby. With a shriek that echoed off the ravine walls, the door gave way. It swung open, revealing darkness within. The metallic moaning grew louder, and Margaret understood. It was the door itself, the frozen hinges protesting movement, the wind whistling through gaps in the metal. Not ghosts, just physics, just the sound of abandonment. Inside, Margaret commanded. Everyone inside, now. One by one, she lowered her children through the opening into the darkness below. She heard them landing on the angled floor, heard their frightened breathing echoing in the enclosed space. When all 6 of the older children were inside, Margaret followed, clutching Samuel to her chest, dropping the last few feet and landing hard enough to rattle her teeth. The darkness was absolute. The cold was marginally less brutal than outside, but only marginally. The metal walls retained no heat, but the wind couldn't reach them here. That alone was worth everything. Margaret pulled the door partially closed, leaving just enough gap for air, but blocking the worst of the wind. Stay together, she whispered to her children. Don't move. Don't make noise. We're safe here. She didn't know if that was true, but as her children pressed against her in the darkness, sharing what little warmth they had, as the strange metallic moaning continued its eerie song around them, Margaret closed her eyes, prayed for dawn. They had found shelter. Now they just had to survive until morning. Outside, in the darkness beyond the train car, something moved, something large. In the snow, fresh prints appeared, paw prints bigger than a man's hand, heading directly toward the iron coffin where 8 human souls now sheltered. The ghost wolf had noticed her guests. Margaret woke to the sound of metal screaming. For a disorienting moment, she didn't know where she was. The darkness was absolute, the cold was bone deep, and the noise was like nothing she'd ever heard. Then memory crashed back. The eviction, the desperate climb, the train car. They were inside the ghost train, and something was making it howl. The children were pressed against her in a tangle of limbs and shallow breathing, all except Rose, who Margaret could hear somewhere to her left, also awake, also listening. The sound came in waves, rising and falling with a rhythm that suggested wind, but felt more malevolent, more intentional. It was a groaning, shrieking, metallic metallic wail that seemed to come from the walls themselves, as if the train car were alive and in agony. "Mama?" Rose's whisper was barely audible over the noise. "What is that?" "The wind," Margaret said, though she wasn't entirely certain. "The wind moving through the metal, that's all." But even as she said it, she heard something else beneath the metallic groaning. Something organic, something that made her blood freeze. A howl, long, low, and unmistakably alive. It came from outside, from somewhere close to the train car, and it was answered by another howl, then another. A chorus of voices that spoke of hunger and territoriality and warning. Wolves. There were wolves outside. Margaret's hand instinctively went to Samuel, pressed against her chest, checking that he was still breathing, still warm. The baby stirred but didn't wake. A small mercy. If he started crying, if the wolves heard, "Everyone stay absolutely still," Margaret whispered, her voice carrying just enough to reach all her children in the dark. "Don't move. Don't make a sound. Do you understand?" She heard the rustle of small head nodding, the suppressed whimper of Michael, who at 4 years old barely comprehended the danger but understood his mother's fear. The darkness seemed to press closer, the cold more intense. Margaret realized they'd been so desperate to escape the wind that she hadn't thought about what they'd do once in. They had no light, no fire, no food, no water except the snow they'd brought in on their clothes. They had shelter, yes, but shelter alone wouldn't keep them alive. The howling continued, sometimes close, sometimes distant, a reminder that they weren't alone in this ravine. Margaret's eyes had adjusted enough to make out vague shapes, the angular walls of the overturned train car, the darker shadows that were her children, the faint gray square of the partially open door above. Dawn must be coming, she realized. They'd survived the night. As gray light began to filter through the door opening, Margaret could finally see their refuge properly. The train car was lying on its side, which meant the floor was now a wall, and one wall was now the floor. They'd spent the night huddled on what had been the car's side, a metal surface that had stolen their body heat all night long. The space was larger than she'd expected. The car had been designed for cargo, not passengers, so the interior was a single long chamber, perhaps 25 feet in length and 8 feet wide. But it was what the growing light revealed about their shelter that made Margaret's heart sink. The car wasn't empty. Scattered across the angled floor were the remnants of whoever had been here last. Not bodies, thank God, but evidence of a leather satchel, rotted and frozen, a tin cup, a boot, just one, half buried in snow that had drifted through gaps in the crumpled end of the car, and everywhere rust and ice and the smell of abandonment. "Mama, I'm hungry." Emma's small voice broke the silence, and immediately the other children echoed the sentiment. They were all hungry. They'd had nothing to eat since yesterday morning, and that had been only a thin gruel. Margaret's own stomach was a knot of emptiness, but she'd learned to ignore it. The children could. "I know, sweetheart," Margaret said, struggling to keep her voice calm. "We'll find something. Rose, James, help me look around. Maybe whoever was here left food." It was a desperate hope, and Margaret knew it. 10 years was a long time. Any food would have rotted or been taken by animals, but she had to try. She had to give her children something to hold on to. They searched the car methodically, Margaret and her 2 oldest children, while the younger ones stayed huddled together for warmth. The leather satchel contained nothing but mold and the remains of papers so deteriorated they turned to powder at touch. The tin cup was empty. Under a pile of snow in the corner, James found what might have once been a blanket, but it was now so frozen and decayed it fell apart when he tried to lift it. Margaret was about to give up when Rose called out from the far end of the car near the crumpled section. "Mama, there's something here. A box, I think. It's stuck." Margaret made her way over, her hands so cold she could barely feel her finger. Rose was right. There was a metal box, perhaps 2 feet long and a foot wide, wedged between the twisted metal of the car's crumpled end and the floor. It looked like it had been thrown there by the impact of the crash and had become trapped as the metal buckled around it. "Help me," Margaret said, and together they pulled. The box didn't budge. It was frozen in place, held by a decade of ice and twisted steel. Margaret wanted to scream with frustration. There could be anything in that box. Food, tools, supplies, but it might as well have been on the moon for all their ability to reach it. "We'll come back to it," Margaret said finally, though the defeat in her voice was clear. "We need to focus on what we can do now." What they could do was pitifully little. Margaret sent James to gather snow, which they melted in the tin cup using the warmth of their bodies, a process that took hours and produced barely enough water for each child to have a few sips. They had no fire, no way to make one. The train car had no wood, and Margaret's matches, if she'd had any, would have been too precious to waste without fuel. The howling had stopped with the dawn, but as Margaret ventured to peer out the partially open door above them, she saw why everyone feared this place. In the snow surrounding the train car were tracks, dozens of them, layered over each other, some fresh from last night, others older. Wolf track, big one, and leading away from the train car toward a cluster of rocks about 50 yards distant, a trail of prints so large they didn't seem real. Margaret stared at those prints, her mind struggling to accept what her eyes were seeing. Each print was bigger than her hand. She'd seen wolf tracks before. Thomas had pointed them out during their first winter in Alaska, but those had been half this size. Whatever had made these tracks wasn't just big for a wolf, it was impossibly big. The ghost wolf. It wasn't a legend. It was real, and it lived here, right here, probably in those rocks, and Margaret had brought her children to sleep in its territory. Mama? Rose had climbed up beside her and looking out at the tracks. Margaret heard her daughter's sharp intake of breath. Those can't be real. Nothing's that big. They're real, Progress, Margaret said quietly, and we're in its territory. We need to be very, very careful. They spent the day trying to make the train car more livable, though livable was a generous term. Margaret used their threadbare blankets to cover some of the gaps where wind whistled through, though there were too many gaps and not enough blankets. She organized their few possessions, the cast iron pot, which was useless without fire, the bundled remains of Thomas's things, which she couldn't bear to open. Rose and James tried to make the floor more comfortable by piling snow in the corners and patting it down to create slightly raised sleeping areas, though sleeping on snow was hardly better than sleeping on metal. The younger children, weak from cold and hunger, could do little but huddle together. Catherine, usually so energetic, was worryingly quiet. Michael had stopped crying, but had also stopped talking, a bad sign. Emma clung to Margaret's skirts, whimpering occasionally. William, the stoic twin, kept asking when Papa was coming home, a question that broke Margaret's heart every time. And baby Samuel, God bless him, nursed when he could, though Margaret's milk was drying up from stress and starvation. She could feel her body failing, prioritizing survival over sustenance for her child, and the knowledge terrified her. How long could she feed him? How long before her milk disappeared entirely and the baby starved? As afternoon faded toward evening and the temperature plummeted again, the howling returned. This time it was different. Not the distant chorus from last night, but a single voice, closer than before. It came from the direction of the rocks, that deep, bone-shaking howl that Margaret now knew belonged to the ghost. The sound resonated through the metal walls of the train car, amplified and distorted until it seemed like the howl was coming from inside their shelter. The children whimpered and pressed closer to Margaret. She held them, feeling their trembling bodies, hearing their quiet sobs of fear, and felt a fury unlike anything she'd ever experienced. Not at the wolf, it was just an animal, doing what animals do, but at Howard, at the world, at every circumstance that had led them to this frozen hell. Her husband had died breaking his back for Howard's gold. Howard had thrown them out to die, and now they were trapped in a metal coffin with a monster outside and nothing inside but cold and hunger and fear. Tell us a story, Mama, Rose said suddenly, her voice cutting through Margaret's dark thought. Like Papa used to. Margaret almost said no. What was the point of stories when they were likely dying? But then she looked at her children's faces, illuminated by the last gray light coming through the door, and she understood. The story wasn't the point. Hope was the point. Defiance was the point. They would not go quietly into death. All right, Margaret said, gathering her children close. Let me tell you about your father, about the day we met. She talked through the evening, through the rising howls outside, through the metallic groaning of their shelter. She told them about Thomas, about his kindness, his strength, his dreams of building a good life in Alaska. She told them about their births, each one, how Thomas had held each baby and wept with joy. She told them they were loved, they were wanted, they were worth more than all the gold Howard Hartley would ever mine. And as she talked, as her children listened and slowly fell into exhausted sleep despite their hunger, despite their cold, Margaret made a decision. They would not simply wait here to die. Tomorrow, she would search the area around the train car. There had to be something. The men who died here must have had supplies, equipment. The railroad wouldn't have sent a gold transport with nothing to sustain the guard. That metal box trapped in the twisted steel, she would find a way to open it if she had to tear the metal apart with her bare hand. The ghost wolf might own this ravine, but Margaret Hartley wasn't giving up. Not yet. Not while her children still breathed. The howling outside grew closer as night fell completely, and Margaret heard something new, a heavy sound, like something large moving through snow. It was approaching the train car. She held her breath, held her children tighter, and waited. The sound stopped right outside. In the darkness, Margaret heard breathing, deep, steady, animal breathing. The ghost wolf was right there, separated from them by only a thin wall of metal. Margaret didn't move, didn't breathe, just held her children and prayed the metal would hold, that the door would stay closed, that dawn would come. After what felt like hours, the breathing stopped. The sounds of movement retreated. The ghost wolf had left, but Margaret knew it would be back. This was its territory, and they were intruders. The question wasn't if it would attack them, but when. As her children slept and the metallic howling of the train cars sang its eerie song around them, Margaret stared up at the darkness and planned. The box. Tomorrow, she would get that box open. Whatever was inside might be their only chance at survival. She just had to live long enough to find out. The second morning in the train car brought a brutality that Margaret hadn't thought possible. The cold had intensified overnight, if such a thing could be imagined. And when she woke, if the fitful half-consciousness she'd experienced could be called waking, frost covered everything. The metal walls were white with it. Her children's breath came in shallow gasps, each one visible in the dim gray light. Emma wasn't moving at all, and for one heart-stopping moment, Margaret thought she'd lost her. But when Margaret shook her daughter gently, Emma's eyes fluttered open, glazed and unfocused. The child was alive, but barely. They all were. Margaret could see it in their faces, in the way their skin had taken on a grayish pallor, in the way their lips were cracked and bleeding, in the absolute stillness of bodies too weak to shiver anymore. They needed food. They needed warmth. They needed these things things today, not tomorrow, or none of them would see another dawn. Rose, Margaret whispered, her voice cracking. Her throat was raw from breathing the frozen air. Rose, wake up. I need you. Her eldest daughter stirred, and Margaret saw the same determination in Rose's eyes that she felt in her own heart. Rose was 14, nearly a woman, and she understood without being told that this was the day they either found salvation or accepted death. The box, Margaret said simply. We're getting it open today, whatever it takes. They left the younger children huddled together, sharing what little warmth they had. James, at 12, was put in charge with strict instructions not to let anyone move, not to let anyone fall asleep. Falling asleep in this cold meant not waking up, and James knew it. His face was pale but resolute as he nodded. Margaret and Rose approached the crumpled end of the train car where the metal box was trapped. In daylight, Margaret could see the crash damage more clearly. The end of the car had accordioned on impact, the metal panels folding in on themselves like paper. The box was wedged deep in the twisted steel, visible but seemingly unreachable. It was made of tin or some similar metal, and from what Margaret could see, it was sealed with a heavy clasp. We need leverage, Rose said, her breath fogging in the air. Something to pry the metal apart. Margaret looked around their shelter with new eyes, searching for anything that could serve as a tool. The train car itself was their best resource. Twisted metal meant sharp edges. Bent panels meant potential pry bars. She found what she needed near the damaged door frame, a section of metal stripping that had torn loose during the crash, about 3 feet long and sturdy enough to serve their purpose. Working together, Margaret and Rose wedged the metal strip into the gap where the box was trapped. The cold made the metal brittle, and Margaret's hands, already raw and bleeding from the previous day's work, screamed with pain as she gripped the makeshift pry bar. But pain was irrelevant now. Only survival mattered. They pulled. The metal groaned but didn't give. They repositioned, found a better angle, and pulled again. This time something shifted. A slight movement, but movement nonetheless. Margaret felt a surge of hope, so powerful it was almost painful. Again, she gasped. Don't stop. They worked for what felt like hours, though it was probably only 30 minutes. Pull, rest, pull, rest. Margaret's vision swam with exhaustion and hypothermia, but she refused to stop. Rose's hands were bleeding now too, but she matched her mother's determination, breath for breath. And then, with a screech of protesting metal that echoed through the train car and surely carried into the ravine beyond, the twisted panel gave way. The box shifted, moved, and suddenly broke free, tumbling out of its prison and landing on the angled floor with a heavy thud. Margaret and Rose stared at it for a moment, hardly daring to believe they'd succeeded. The box was real, solid, and now within reach. Margaret's hands shook as she reached for it, not from cold, though that was part of it, but from the weight of hope and fear combined. What if it was empty? What if it contained nothing useful? What if this last desperate gamble yielded nothing? The clasp was frozen solid, of course. Margaret had expected that. She used her makeshift pry bar to work at it, chipping away ice, forcing the mechanism. Her bleeding hands made the metal slippery, and twice the bar slipped and gouged her palms. But she didn't care. Behind her, she heard James trying to keep the younger children calm, heard Emma's weak crying, heard Michael asking in a small voice if Mama had found food yet. The clasp gave way with a snap that sounded like a gunshot in the enclosed space. Margaret's heart hammered as she lifted the lid, Rose crowding close beside her, both of them holding their breath. The box was packed tight with items wrapped in oilcloth, the kind sailors used to protect goods from moisture. Whoever had sealed this box had known what they were doing, had taken pains to preserve the contents against time and weather. With trembling fingers, Margaret unwrapped the first pack. It was a journal. Leather-bound, the pages brittle but intact, covered in neat handwriting. Margaret opened it to the first page and read, William Brennan, conductor, Alaska Gold Transport Service, January 1885. A journal, the conductor's journal. Margaret felt a moment of crushing disappointment. They needed food, not words, but something made her keep looking. She unwrapped the next package and her breath caught in her throat. Food, actual food. Tins of preserved meat, sealed tight, the metal still intact. Hardtack biscuits wrapped in layers of oilcloth, rock hard but edible. A small bag of coffee beans, precious as gold in Alaska. Matches, blessed matches, in a waterproof tin. And at the bottom of the box, something that made Margaret want to weep. A fold of cloth that, when unwrapped, revealed 6 small vials of clear liquid. Each vial was labeled in neat script, laudanum for pain and fever. Mama? Rose's voice was shaking. Is that food? Margaret said, and her voice broke on the word. It's food, Rose. We're going to eat. The next hour was controlled chaos. Margaret forced herself to be methodical, to ration, to think beyond the immediate desperation. She opened one tin of preserved meat. It was salted pork, still good after 10 years in its sealed container, and divided it into portions so small they were almost insulting. But it was food. It was sustenance. It was life. She gave each child a piece of meat the size of her thumb, a fragment of hardtack to soften in their mouth, and a tiny sip of water from melted snow. It wasn't enough to fill anyone's stomach, but it was enough to push back the edge of starvation, enough to give them strength for another day. Baby Samuel was the challenge. He needed milk, and Margaret's had nearly dried up, but the laudanum, Margaret knew from experience with Thomas's mining injuries, that it could be diluted and used to calm a baby, to let them sleep through hunger. It was dangerous, yes, but no more dangerous than starvation. She mixed a single drop with water and let Samuel drink it from her finger. The baby's crying stopped, and he slipped into a peaceful sleep. As her children ate their meager rations and slowly, color began returning to their faces, Margaret turned her attention to the journal. She needed to understand who William Brennan had been, why he'd packed this survival box, what had happened in this train car 10 years ago. The first entries were routine: dates, cargo manifests, weather conditions. William wrote with the precision of a man who took his job seriously. But as Margaret flipped forward through the pages, the tone changed. She found the entry dated February 14th, 1885, and began to read. "The crash was not an accident," William had written, his handwriting suddenly less neat, more urgent. "I saw Matthews tamper with the brake mechanism. Howard Hartley paid him to do it. I'm certain now. Hartley wants the gold for himself, wants to claim the insurance and keep the ore. Matthews doesn't know that Hartley planned for no survivor. Neither of us were meant to make it out of these mountains alive." Margaret's blood ran cold. Howard. Even 10 years ago, Howard had been orchestrating disasters for profit. Her husband Thomas had died in a tunnel that accidentally collapsed. These men had died in a train that accidentally crashed. How many other accidents had Howard engineered over the years? She read on. William described the crash, the impact, the death of Matthews and the third guard. He described finding himself trapped, his leg crushed beneath twisted metal, knowing he would die here. But then the entries took a strange turn. February 16th, 1885. "I am not alone. There is a wolf, or what I took for a wolf at first, though she is far larger than any wolf I have seen. She appeared yesterday, drawn by the blood, I think. She did not attack. She simply watched. Her coat is pure white, unmarked, like fresh snow. Her eyes are pale amber. She is magnificent and terrifying in equal measure." Margaret found herself gripping the journal tighter, drawn into William's account despite the cold, despite everything. February 18th, 1885. "The white wolf returned today. I am delirious with pain and fever, I know, but I swear she looks at me with something like concern, intelligence. I threw her a piece of the salt pork from my ration, expecting her to snatch it and run. Instead, she ate it slowly, never taking her eyes from me, then lay down at a distance. She has not left since." Boss. The entries continued, describing days of agony as William waited to die. But running through them all was the threat of the wolf, the ghost wolf, though William didn't call her that. He called her the guardian. He described how she returned every day, how he fed her from his carefully rationed supplies, how she began sleeping closer to him, how her presence somehow made the dying less lonely. February 25th, 1885. "I sealed the survival box today while I still have strength. If anyone finds this, know that the train crash was murder, not accident. Howard Hartley is responsible. The gold is still in the car, hidden beneath false floorboards in the cargo section. I cannot reach it with my crushed leg, cannot even move from where I lie, but it is there. $20,000 worth of refined ore, enough to make a person wealthy beyond dream." Margaret's hands shook as she read those words. $20,000, a fortune, hidden somewhere in this very train car. And Howard didn't know. He thought the gold had been lost in the crash, destroyed or carried away by the railroad company. But it was here. It had been here all along. February 28th, 1885. "This will be my final entry. I can feel death approaching, a coldness that has nothing to do with the winter. My leg is infected. I can smell the rot. The fever makes my hand shake, but I must record this. The guardian has not left my side in 3 days. She has let me rest my hand on her fur, has let me feel the warmth of her body. In my delirium, I told her everything, about the crash, about Hartley's betrayal, about the gold I can't reach. I told her to guard this place, to keep it safe. She looked at me with those amber eyes. I know it sounds mad, but I felt she understood. She will guard this place when I am gone. I feel certain of it." The entry ended there. Margaret turned the page and found one final note, written in a hand so shaky it was barely legible. March 1st, 1885. "I am dying. The guardian knows it. She has not moved from my side. If anyone ever reads this, if anyone ever finds this place, know that the wolf is not your enemy. She guards the dead, yes, but also guards what they left behind. Treat her with respect, and she will not harm. She is no ghost. She is simply waiting. For what? I do not know." That was the last entry. William Brennan had died here in this train car 10 years ago. His body was long gone, probably dragged off by scavengers or buried in snow, but his words remained. And his guardian, the ghost wolf, had remained too. For 10 years, she had kept watch over this ravine, over the place where her only human friend had died. Margaret looked up from the journal to find Rose staring at her with wide eyes. "Mama, what does it mean?" "It means," Margaret said slowly, her mind racing, "that the wolf isn't hunting us. She's protecting something or someone. Maybe she doesn't even know William is gone. Maybe she's still guarding him even after all these years." "The gold," Rose breathed. "If it's still here." "Don't," Margaret cut her off. "Don't even think about that yet. Right now we focus on survival." The journal said false floorboards in the cargo section. This is the cargo section. That means somewhere beneath us, there's a hidden compartment. Margaret stood, her body protesting every movement, and began examining the floor of the train car with new eyes. The car was lying on its side, which meant the floor was now vertical. She ran her hands along the metal panel, looking for seams, for irregularities, for anything that suggested a hidden space. It was Rose who found it. Mama, here. This panel sounds different when I knock on it. Margaret joined her daughter, and together they examined the section of floor. Rose was right. When tapped, it rang hollow, different from the solid thunk of the rest of the metal. Margaret used her pry bar to work at the edges, and after several minutes of effort, the panel popped loose. Behind it was a space about 2 feet deep and 4 feet square, and it was full. Margaret pulled out package after package, each one carefully wrapped and sealed. Blankets, real wool blanket, not the threadbare rags they had been using. More food, tins and tins of it, enough to feed them for weeks. A hunting knife in a leather sheath, a coil of rope, a small hatchet, fishing line and hooks. And at the very bottom, wrapped in layers of oilcloth and sealed with wax, heavy rectangular packages that could only be one thing. Gold, refined gold ore, formed into ingots, each one stamped with the Alaska Mining Company seal. Margaret counted them. 12 ingots, each one weighing perhaps 5 pounds. 60 pounds of gold. William had been right. A fortune had been hidden here, waiting. But more important than the gold right now were the survival supplies. With these, they could make fire. With fire, they could melt snow properly for water. They could cook. They could survive. Rose, Margaret said, her voice shaking with emotions she couldn't name. Relief, gratitude, disbelief, all mixed together. Get your brothers and sisters. We're going to have a real meal. As Rose ran to wake the other children, Margaret remained kneeling by the hidden compartment, William's journal still in her hands. She looked around the train car with new understanding. This wasn't just a shelter. It was a gift from a dying man, preserved across a decade, protected by a creature who understood loyalty even when the object of that loyalty was long gone. Outside, she heard it, the howl, the ghost wolf's voice carrying across the ravine. But this time, Margaret didn't hear a threat. She heard a question, a watchfulness, a presence that might not be hostile after all. Thank you, William, Margaret whispered to the empty air. Thank you for not giving up. Thank you for leaving this behind. And as her children gathered around her, as she used William's matches to light a fire for the first time in days, as the smell of cooking food filled the train car and her children's faces lit with hope, Margaret made a decision. They would survive here. They would use what William had left them. And when they were strong enough, she would find a way to thank the guardian who had kept his final gifts safe all these years. The ghost wolf had been waiting for someone to find William's legacy. That someone was Margaret Hartley, and she would not let either of them down. The fire changed everything. It wasn't a large fire. Margaret was too careful with their precious fuel supply for that. But even a small flame in the cast iron pot, fed with splinters of wood from a broken crate she'd found in the hidden compartment, provided warmth that felt miraculous after 2 days of bone-deep cold. The children gathered around it like worshippers at an altar, their hands extended toward the heat, their faces slowly losing that terrible gray pallor. Margaret cooked a proper meal using the supplies from William's cache. She opened a tin of beans, added some of the salt pork, and heated it all together until the train car filled with a smell so intoxicating it made her dizzy. The children ate slowly, savoring every bite, their bellies finally receiving something more than scraps. Even baby Samuel seemed stronger, nursing more vigorously after Margaret herself had eaten and her milk began flowing again. As the children ate and the fire crackled, Margaret returned to William's journal. There was more to read, earlier entries from before the crash, and she felt compelled to understand this man who had, across the span of a decade, saved her family's lives. She learned that William had been 42 years old, a widower himself. His own wife lost to cholera 3 years before the train crash. He'd had no children. He'd been a solitary man who found purpose in his work, in the careful documentation of cargo manifests and schedules. But scattered through the routine entries were observations that revealed a deeper soul. William noticed birds, weather patterns, the way light fell on the mountains. He wrote about the miners he met, their hopes and hardship. He'd been a good man, Margaret realized, a kind man. And Howard Hartley had murdered him as casually as one might swat a fly, all for gold that Howard hadn't even managed to claim. As afternoon faded toward evening on their third day in the train car, Margaret knew they needed to venture outside. Their water supply was running low. They'd been melting snow from inside the car, but it wasn't enough, and she needed to understand their surroundings better, needed to know what resources might be available beyond the metal walls that sheltered them. Rose, James, Margaret said, I'm going outside to scout the area. I need you two to watch the little. Keep the fire small. Don't let it go out, but don't make it big enough to smoke badly. Do you understand? Both children nodded, though Margaret saw the fear in Rose's eyes. What about the wolf, Mama? What if she's out there? Then I'll come back in Margaret said with more confidence than she felt. But according to William's journal, she's not hostile. She's protective. There's a difference. Margaret bundled herself in one of William's blankets and retrieved the hunting knife from the cache. It wasn't much of a weapon against a wolf the size William had described, but it was something. She climbed up to the train car's door, took a deep breath of the frigid air, and pulled herself out into the late afternoon light. The cold hit her like a physical blow, stealing her breath for a moment. But the sun was out, weak and pale but present. And after days in the dim interior of the car, even winter sunlight felt precious. Margaret pulled the door partially closed behind her. She could still escape back inside quickly if needed, and surveyed their surroundings. The train car lay in a ravine about 30 feet deep, the steep walls rising on either side. Snow covered everything, pristine and white, marked only by tracks. So many tracks. Margaret's eyes followed them, reading the story they told. Rabbit tracks, small and clustered, showing where the creatures had bounded through the snow. Larger tracks that might have been fox or lynx. Bird prints, delicate as lace. And everywhere, dominating all the others, the massive paw prints of the ghost wolf. Margaret followed the wolf tracks with her eyes, noting how they circled the train car in a wide patrol pattern, how they led to and from the cluster of rocks about 50 yards away that she'd noticed on that first terrible dawn. The wolf's den, almost certainly. William had written that the guardian stayed close, and apparently that habit had persisted for 10 years. Moving carefully, testing each step before committing her weight, Margaret climbed down from the overturned train car and stood in the snow of the ravine floor. From this vantage point, she could see more of their situation. The ravine ran roughly north-south, with the train car lodged in a wider section where the walls pulled back slightly. To the south, the ravine narrowed and appeared to climb upward, possibly a way out, though it would be a brutal climb in winter. To the north, the ravine widened further and appeared to level out. That direction might lead to better terrain, but it would also take her farther from their shelter. Margaret decided to explore northward first. She stayed close to the eastern wall of the ravine, keeping the train car in sight, moving slowly and quietly. Every few steps, she paused to listen and look, her hand on the knife handle, though she kept it sheathed. The silence was profound, broken only by the occasional whisper of wind through the rocks. She'd gone perhaps 100 yards when she found the stream. It was mostly frozen, but in one section, where the water moved faster over rocks, there was a gap in the ice, a small pool of flowing water. Margaret could have wept at the sight. Fresh water, easily accessible, meant they could stop rationing melted snow. They could drink properly, cook properly. This single discovery made the train car not just a shelter, but a viable home. Margaret was kneeling by the stream, filling the tin cup she'd brought with her when she heard it. Not the howl this time, but something softer. A low rumble, almost a growl, but continuous. It was coming from behind her. She froze, her heart hammering so hard she could hear it. Slowly, carefully, she turned her head. The ghost wolf stood 30 feet away. William's descriptions hadn't done her justice. The wolf was enormous. Her shoulder would easily reach Margaret's waist if they stood side by side. Her coat was pure white, so white it almost seemed to glow in the winter light, thick and pristine. But it was her eyes that held Margaret paralyzed. They were pale amber, almost gold, and they fixed on Margaret with an intensity that felt almost human in its focus. The wolf wasn't snarling. She wasn't in a hunting crowd. She simply stood there watching, that continuous low rumble coming from her chest. Not quite a growl, not quite a warning, more like a question. Who are you? What are you doing here? This is my territory. Margaret forced herself to breathe, to think. William had written that the guardian wasn't hostile, that she protected rather than attacked. But William had fed her, had earned her trust over days of dying together. Margaret was a stranger, an intruder. Slowly moving with excruciating care, Margaret pulled the cup away from her lips and set it down in the snow. Then, keeping her eyes on the wolf, but not staring directly, she remembered Thomas saying that direct eye contact was a threat in wolf language. She backed away. 1 step, 2 step, 3. The wolf watched but didn't move, didn't follow. That rumbling sound continued. Margaret had backed up perhaps 10 feet when her boot caught on something hidden beneath the snow. She stumbled, fell backward, landing hard on her tailbone in the snow. The cup she'd set down tipped over, spilling water. The wolf's rumble cut off. In the sudden silence, Margaret's breathing sounded deafening. She waited for the attack, for teeth and claws and death. Instead, the wolf did something completely unexpected. She walked forward, not toward Margaret, but toward the spilled cup. She sniffed it, then looked at Margaret, then looked back at the stream. And then deliberately, the massive wolf picked up the tin cup in her jaws, carefully the way a mother might carry a puppy, walked to the stream, dipped the cup to fill it, and walked back. She set the cup down in the snow halfway between Margaret and herself, then backed away. Margaret stared at the cup, at the wolf, back at the cup. Her mind struggled to process what had just happened. The wolf had helped her, had understood that Margaret wanted water, had fallen and had brought her the cup. Thank you, Margaret whispered, not sure why she was talking to a wolf, but feeling the words were necessary. Thank you, guardian. The wolf's ears pricked forward at the word guardian, William's name for her. For a long moment, wolf and woman regarded each other. Then the ghost wolf did something even more astonishing. She lowered herself to the snow, front legs extended, head down, in a posture that was unmistakably submissive, a gesture of peace. Margaret's breath caught. You remember him, don't you? You remember William. The wolf's tail moved just slightly, not quite a walk, but a response, recognition of the name. Slowly, Margaret got to her feet. She picked up the tin cup, now refilled, and took a drink. The water was achingly cold, perfectly clean. The wolf watched but made no move to approach further. Margaret took another sip, then carefully poured half the water out into the snow, an offering, a sharing of the resource. The wolf stood, shook herself, sending a small cloud of snow flying from her coat, and then, without warning, simply turned and loped away. Within seconds, she disappeared into the rocks, moving with a grace that seemed impossible for something so large. Margaret stood alone by the stream, her hands shaking, her mind reeling. The ghost wolf wasn't a monster. She was a guardian, just as William had written, a creature who'd learned 10 years ago that humans could be kind, that sharing resources was possible, that not all two-legged creatures meant harm. Margaret filled the cup again, this time all the way, and began the walk back to the train car. Her mind was racing with possibility. The wolf clearly claimed this territory, but she wasn't excluding them from it. The interaction at the stream had been a test, maybe, or an introduction. The wolf had helped her, had communicated in ways that transcended species. If Margaret could maintain this fragile peace, if she could somehow build on William's old friendship with the guardian, she was so lost in thought that she almost didn't see them. But movement caught her eye, and she looked up to see 5 more wolves emerging from the rocks where the guardian had disappeared. These were normal-sized wolves, large but not impossibly so, with coats of gray and brown and white. They formed a loose semicircle, and Margaret realized with a jolt of fear that she was surrounded, but they didn't attack. They simply sat, watching her with eyes that reminded her eerily of the guardian's amber gaze. Pack member, the ghost wolf's pack. And if the alpha had declared Margaret acceptable, then the pack would honor that declaration. Margaret kept walking, forcing herself to move normally, not to run, not to show fear. The wolves watched her pass. One of them, a gray male with scarred ears, stood and loped alongside her for a few paces before veering away. It felt like an escort, like they were making sure she found her way home safe. When Margaret reached the train car and climbed back inside, her children rushed to her with questions and fears. But Margaret barely heard them. She was thinking about the wolf pack, about the guardian's strange act of helpfulness, about William's journal and his final days with a creature he'd befriended in the shadow of death. "Mama!" Rose's voice cut through her thoughts. "What happened? You were gone so long. We were worried. The wolf." "I met her," Margaret said quietly. "The guardian, the ghost wolf. And she's not our enemy, Rose. She's something else. Something I'm not sure I understand yet, but something that might help us survive." That night, as the fire burned low and the children slept, Margaret sat with William's journal and read his final entries again. She understood now what he'd meant about the guardian understanding, about her keeping watch. The wolf had remained in this ravine for 10 years, guarding the place where her friend had died, defending it from intruders, waiting, perhaps, for someone worthy to claim what William had left behind. Margaret thought about her own situation. Widowed like William, lone like William, betrayed by Howard Hartley, just as William had been. There was a symmetry to it that felt almost deliberate, as if fate or God or simple chance had led her to this exact place, to this exact shelter, to this exact guardian. "I won't waste it," Margaret whispered to the darkness, to William's ghost, to the wolf sleeping somewhere in the rocks outside. "I won't waste what you left us. We'll survive here. We'll thrive here. And somehow, some way, I'll make Howard pay for what he did to you, to Thomas, to all of us." Outside, carried on the wind, came the guardian's howl, long and mournful and somehow approving. The ghost wolf was calling to her pack, telling them that the strangers in the metal den were under her protection, that this territory had new residents, that William's legacy had been claimed at last. Margaret pulled the wool blanket tighter around her shoulders and fed another small piece of wood to the fire. They had food, they had water, they had shelter, and they had impossibly an alliance with the creature everyone feared most. The train car was no longer a coffin, it was becoming a home, and the howling outside was no longer a threat, it was the sound of family. Spring came slowly to the Alaska mountains, more a promise than a reality. The days grew incrementally longer, the sun climbed slightly higher, and the brutal killing cold of February gave way to the merely bitter cold of March. For Margaret and her children, this subtle shift meant the difference between survival and comfort. They'd been living in the train car for 3 weeks now, and what had begun as desperate refuge had transformed into something approaching a home. Margaret had established routines because routines gave structure, and structure gave hope. Every morning she woke before the children and rebuilt the fire from embers she'd carefully banked the night before. While the train car warmed and water melted for washing and drinking, she inventoried their supply. William's cache was holding up better than she'd dared hope. The man had provision for a Wanganang seed, though he'd never lived to benefit from his own preparation. They had enough food for perhaps another month if they were careful, and with the weather improving, Margaret had begun thinking about hunting and foraging to supplement their stores. The children had adapted with the resilience that only children possess. Rose had become Margaret's lieutenant, taking charge of the younger ones while Margaret ventured outside. James, at 12, had appointed himself the family's woodsman, spending hours splitting the crates and boards they'd found in the hidden compartment into kindling and fuel. The younger children had their tasks too. Catherine and William kept the sleeping area organized. Emma helped Rose with baby Samuel, and even 4-year-old Michael had his job, watching the fire to make sure it never went out. But the most remarkable adaptation belonged to all of them collectively. They had learned to live with wolves. The guardian visited the train car every day, always at dawn, always following the same pattern. She would approach from her den in the rocks, circle the train car once at a distance of about 30 yards, then sit and watch for several minutes before departing. Margaret had begun leaving offerings at the same spot each morning, usually a portion of of meat from their supplies, sometimes just bones with meat scraps. Once a whole tin of sardines that William had packed and that the guardian had devoured with obvious delight. The offering wasn't tribute. Margaret understood that now. It was communication. It was the continuation of a friendship that William had begun a decade ago, a bridge across species maintained by the simple act of sharing food. The guardian accepted the offerings with a dignity that was almost human, never snatching or showing aggression, always approaching calmly and eating deliberately before departing. But it was what happened on the morning of their 21st day in the train car that changed everything. Margaret had just placed the morning offering, a generous portion of salt pork, on the flat rock she designated for this purpose. She was turning to head back to the train car when she heard a sound that made her blood freeze. Not the guardian's deep, measured howl, but something higher pitched, more plaintive, a whimper, a cry of distress. The guardian emerged from the rocks, but she wasn't alone. She was carrying something in her jaws, moving more slowly than Margaret had ever seen her move, and that continuous whimper was coming from the bundles she carried. When the wolf was about 20 feet away, she carefully set her burden down in the snow and backed away, looking at Margaret with those amber eyes. It was a cub, a wolf cub, perhaps 8 weeks old, with fur that was more gray than white, and it was injured. Margaret could see blood on its hind leg, could see how it tried to stand and collapsed with a yelp of pain. The guardian looked at the cub, then at Margaret, then back at the cub. The message was unmistakable. Help. My baby needs help. Margaret's mind raced. This was a test, obviously, but also something more. This was trust on a level she'd never imagined. The guardian was offering her offspring to a human, asking for aid, making herself vulnerable in a way that went against every survival instinct. Rose, Margaret called softly, not taking her eyes off the guardian. Bring me the medical supply. The laudanum, clean cloth, and William's knife. Quickly. Rose appeared moments later, her eyes widening when she saw the cub. Mama, what? She's asking for help, Margaret said quietly. The way William helped her 10 years ago. She remembers. She trusts us. Margaret approached the cub slowly, watching the guardian for any sign of aggression. The massive wolf remained still, though every muscle in her body was tense. When Margaret knelt beside the injured cub, the guardian whined, a sound of worry, of fear for her offspring, but not of threat. The cub's injury was bad, but not fatal. Something had caught its leg, trapped maybe, or the cub had cut itself on sharp ice. The wound was deep and already showing signs of infection. Without treatment, the cub would likely die within days. I'm going to help, Margaret said softly, speaking to the guardian as much as to herself. I promise I'll help. She worked as gently as she could, cleaning the wound with melted snow, using a precious drop of the laudanum to dull the cub's pain. The little wolf whimpered and tried to bite, but Rose held it steady while Margaret worked. The guardian watched every movement, her body rigid with tension, but she didn't intervene. She was letting this happen. She was choosing to trust. Margaret cleaned the wound thoroughly, applied a paste made from ground-up hardtack and water, not ideal, but it would help stop infection, and wrapped the leg in clean cloth. The cub's breathing slowed as the laudanum took effect, and it relaxed into Rose's arm. There, Margaret said, sitting back on her heels. That's the best I can do. He'll need to rest, keep the wound clean. If he doesn't use the leg for a few days, the guardian moved forward before Margaret could finish. Not aggressively, but deliberately, closing the distance between them until she stood directly in front of Margaret. So close that Margaret could feel the heat radiating from the wolf's massive body, could smell the wild scent of her fur. They looked at each other, human and wolf, mother and mother, two creatures who understood the desperation of trying to keep children alive in a hostile world. And then the guardian did something that Margaret knew she would remember for the rest of her life. The massive wolf lowered her head and gently pressed her forehead against Margaret's, holding the position for 3 heartbeats before stepping back. You're welcome, Margaret whispered, tears streaming down her face. You saved my children. It's only right that I help save yours. The guardian picked up her cub, now sleeping peacefully from the laudanum, and carried him back toward the rocks. But before disappearing, she turned and made a sound Margaret had never heard from her before. A low, rumbling chuff that sounded almost like laughter, contentment, approval. When Margaret returned to the train car, she found all her children crowded around the door, having watched the entire interaction. Their faces showed awe and wonder and a little fear, but mostly they looked proud of their mother, who had just done something impossible. Mama, James said quietly, does this mean the wolves are our friends now? Margaret thought about that for a moment before answering. Not friends, exactly, but family, maybe. Pack. We're part of the guardian's territory, part of what she protects. And in return, we protect what matters to her. Over the following days, the relationship between the Hartley family and the guardian's pack deepened in ways Margaret couldn't have predicted. The injured cub recovered quickly under Margaret's care. The guardian brought him back twice more for Margaret to check the wound and change the dressing. The other pack members, who had always kept their distance, began approaching closer to the train car. Not threatening, just present, watchful, accepting. And then came the morning when Margaret found a gift waiting on the offering rock. Not her gift to the wolf, but their gift to her. A freshly killed rabbit, still warm, its neck broken cleanly. The guardian sat nearby, watching, waiting for Margaret's reaction. Thank you, Margaret said, picking up the rabbit with reverence. Fresh meat, protein they desperately needed. Thank you, guardian. The wolf's tail moved just slightly, a wag. The first time Margaret had seen her do that. That night, Margaret prepared the rabbit rabbit with a skill born of necessity, teaching Rose and James how to skin and clean it properly, how to use every part of the animal. They roasted it over their fire, and the smell was glorious. The children ate with enthusiasm, their bodies craving the fresh meat after weeks of preserved rations. "This is better than anything Papa ever brought home," Emma said innocently, and Margaret felt her heart clench. Thomas would have loved this, would have been so proud of what they'd built here, would have marveled at the alliance with the wolf. After dinner, as the children settled for sleep, Margaret sat by the fire and added to the journal she'd started keeping. She'd found blank pages at the back of William's journal and had begun recording their own story, a continuation of the tale he'd started. She wrote about the guardian's trust, about the healing of the cub, about the gift of the rabbit. She wrote about how William's kindness had echoed across a decade, had saved not just her family, but had created this impossible peace between human and wolf. The next morning brought a development that Margaret had both hoped for and dreaded. As she emerged from the train car to place the morning offering, she found Howard Hartley's foreman, a brutish man named Griggs, standing at the southern edge of the ravine. "Well, well," Griggs called down, his voice echoing off the ravine walls. "The widow Hartley. Howard figured you died in the snow. Shame you didn't. Would have saved him some trouble." Margaret's blood ran cold. "What do you want, Griggs?" "Howard wants to know where you went. Wants to make sure you're not causing trouble, spreading lies about the company." Griggs grinned, showing brown teeth. "Though I gotta say, living in the ghost train, that's desperation. How long you think you'll last out here with all those brats?" "Long enough," Margaret said, her hand moving to the knife at her belt. "Tell Howard I'm not his concern anymore." "Oh, but you are," Griggs said, starting to climb down into the ravine. "See, folks in town are talking, saying it's strange how Thomas died right after that tunnel inspection, right after he told Howard the supports were bad, saying maybe it wasn't such an accident after all. Howard wants to make sure you're not spreading those ideas around." Margaret's heart hammered. So Thomas had known, had documented the safety violation, and Howard had killed him for it, just like he'd killed William Brennan, just like he'd probably killed a dozen other men who'd gotten in the way of profit. "I'm not spreading anything," Margaret said carefully, watching Griggs descend. "I'm just trying to survive. We're no threat to anyone." "That's good," Griggs said, now halfway down the ravine wall, "because Howard wanted me to make sure. Wanted me to—" He stopped mid-sentence, stopped moving entirely. His face had gone pale, his eyes fixed on something behind Margaret. Margaret turned slowly and saw what Griggs was seeing. The guardian stood 30 feet away, but she wasn't alone. The entire pack was with her, 7 wolves in total, ranging in size from the massive alpha female to the youngsters who were nearly full-grown. They stood in a loose line, silent, watching, radiating a collective menace that needed no snarling or growling to be understood. "Jesus Christ," Griggs breathed. "The ghost wolf. She's real. They're all real." "Yes," Margaret said, finding her voice remarkably steady. "And this is their territory. You're trespassing." The guardian took a single step forward. Just one. The message was clear. Griggs didn't wait for a second step. He scrambled back up the ravine wall with a speed Margaret wouldn't have thought possible, slipping and cursing but not slowing down. At the top, he turned and shouted down, "Howard's gonna hear about this. You can't hide out here forever, widow. You and your brats are living on borrowed time." Then he was gone, running back toward Greystone as fast as his legs could carry him. Margaret turned to the guardian, who was still standing with her pack, watching Margaret with those intelligent amber eyes. "Thank you," Margaret said quietly. Again, the guardian's response was to turn and lead her pack back to the rocks, but not before one of the younger wolves, the healed cub, Margaret realized, broke formation and trotted over to Margaret. He sat at her feet and looked up at her, tongue lolling, looking for all the world like he was smiling. Margaret knelt and for the first time reached out to touch a wolf. The cub's fur was thick and soft, still carrying some of its puppy texture. He leaned into her hand, and Margaret felt something crack open in her chest, some wall she'd built around her heart. "You're going to cause trouble, aren't you?" she murmured to the cub. "Going to make me believe things are possible that shouldn't be." The cub licked her hand, then bounded away to follow his mother. That night, Margaret gathered her children and told them the truth. About Thomas's death, about Howard's crimes, about why Griggs had come, about the danger they might be in, now that Howard knew where they were. "But we have something Howard doesn't," Margaret said, looking at each of her 7 children in turn. "We have ally. We have the guardian and her pack. We have this shelter that William left us. We have each other. And we have the truth about what Howard's done. As long as we're alive, we're a threat to him. So we need to stay alive. We need to stay strong. We need to protect each other and our wolf family." "How, Mama?" Rose asked. "How do we fight a man like Howard? He owns the mine, the town, everything." Margaret pulled out William's journal and opened it to the entry about the gold. "We start by using what William left us, not just the supplies, but the truth. William wrote it all down, how Howard sabotaged the train, murdered 3 men, stole gold. It's all here. And when we're ready, when we're strong enough, we take this to the authorities in Juneau. We make sure Howard pays for what he did to William, to Thomas, to all of us." "And until then?" James asked. "Until then," Margaret said, "we survive, we learn, we grow stronger." The guardian protected William's legacy for 10 years, waiting for someone worthy to claim. "We're going to prove we're worthy. We're going to prove that kindness and courage are stronger than cruelty and greed." Outside, the Guardian's howl rose into the night, and this time Margaret's children didn't flinch. They listened to it like a lullaby, like a promise, like the voice of a friend calling them home. The train car had become more than shelter. It had become a fortress, and the Ghost Wolf's pack had become more than guardian. They had become family. April brought the first real signs of spring to the ravine. The sun stayed above the horizon longer each day, and while nights were still brutally cold, the daytime temperatures occasionally climbed above freezing. Water dripped from rocks, creating a constant musical sound that spoke of life and renewal. The snow, which had been pristine and deep, began to compact and recede, revealing the brown earth beneath and occasionally glimpses of green, hardy mountain grasses pushing through the thaw, determined to claim their season. Margaret had been living in the train car for 2 months now, and the transformation was remarkable. What had been a desperate refuge was now genuinely a home. James had fashioned a door from salvaged wood and canvas, properly hinged, that could be closed against the wind while still allowing smoke from their fire to escape. Rose had organized their supplies with military precision, creating a pantry system that let them track exactly what they had and how long it would last. The younger children had claimed spaces within the car, personalizing them with small treasures found in the ravine. Interesting rocks, bird feathers, bits of ice that caught the light. But the most significant change was in Margaret herself. The desperate, grieving widow who had stumbled into this ravine 2 months ago was gone, replaced by someone harder, more capable, more fierce. Her hands, once soft, were now calloused and strong. Her body, lean from rationing, was wiry with muscle from the constant work of survival. Her eyes, which had been dull with shock and loss, now burned with purpose. She had begun hunting. The Guardian had taught her, in a way, through observation. Margaret had watched how the wolf pack worked together, how they moved through the territory, how they read signs in the snow and wind. She'd found William's rifle in the hidden compartment, a Winchester that had been carefully wrapped and preserved, along with a box of ammunition. The first time she'd fired it, the sound had echoed through the ravine like thunder, and she'd missed the rabbit she'd been aiming at by a full yard. But she'd practiced, spending precious bullets to learn the weapon, and now she could bring down small game with reasonable consistency. The Guardian seemed to approve of these hunting expeditions. Sometimes Margaret would find the wolf pack nearby when she ventured out with the rifle, as if they were supervising, making sure she stayed safe. Once, when a mountain lion had shown interest in Margaret from a rocky outcrop, the Guardian had materialized from nowhere and placed herself between human and cat, her massive body radiating threat until the lion slunk away. They were packed, Margaret and the wolf. The offering rock had become a place of mutual exchange. Margaret left portions of her kills, the wolves left portions of theirs. Sometimes Margaret would find the Guardian simply sitting near the train car, watching the children play, her presence protective and calm. The healed cub, whom Emma had named Ghost because of his pale gray fur, had become almost tame, approaching close enough to take food from Rose's hand, though he always retreated quickly to his mother's side. But it was on the morning of April 15th that Margaret woke to a change she hadn't anticipated. She emerged from the train car to find the Guardian pacing near the offering rock, her movements agitated, restless. The wolf kept looking toward her den in the rocks, then back at Margaret, then toward the den again. Her body language was unmistakable even across species. Something was happening, something important, something that made the normally composed alpha wolf anxious. Margaret approached slowly, speaking in the low, calm voice she'd learned the Guardian responded on. "What is it, girl? What's wrong?" The Guardian whined, a sound of distress, and paced toward the rocks, looking back at Margaret as if to say, "Follow me." When Margaret didn't immediately move, the wolf came back and gently, so gently, took Margaret's sleeve in her teeth and tugged. "Mama?" Rose had emerged from the train car, sensing something unusual. "What's happening?" "I think she wants me to follow her," Margaret said, her heart beginning to pound. "Stay here with your brothers and sisters. Keep them inside. I'll be back soon." Margaret followed the Guardian through the melting snow toward the rocky den. She'd never been this close to the wolf's lair before. It had always felt like an intrusion, a violation of boundaries. But the Guardian was leading her there deliberately, urgently, and Margaret understood that something fundamental had shifted. The den entrance was a gap between two massive boulders, barely large enough for the Guardian to squeeze through. The wolf stopped at the entrance and looked at Margaret, whined again, then disappeared inside. Margaret hesitated, every survival instinct screaming at her not to enter a wolf's den, but then she heard it, a sound that transcended species, that spoke to something primal in her mother's heart. Crying, weak, newborn crying. The Guardian was giving birth. Margaret knelt at the den entrance, her mind racing. Why had the Guardian brought her here? What did the wolf need? Was this trust or something else? Then she heard another sound from within the den, a whimper of pain, of distress, different from the newborn cries. Something was wrong. "Guardian?" Margaret called softly. "Can I come in? Can I help?" A low rumble from within, not threatening but acknowledged. Permission. Margaret forced herself to breathe slowly, to stay calm, and squeeze through the entrance into the darkness beyond. The den opened up once she was past the entrance, becoming a chamber perhaps 6 feet across and 4 feet high. Not tall enough to stand, but spacious enough for a wolf and her litter. The smell was overwhelming. Earth and musk and blood and something else. Something wrong. As Margaret's eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering through the entrance, she saw the Guardian lying on her side, her flanks heaving with effort. Around her were 4 tiny pups, already born, mewling and trying to nurse. But the guardian's attention wasn't on them. She was straining, clearly trying to deliver another pup, and clearly struggling. Margaret had helped with difficult births before, human births, when she'd assisted the midwife in Greystone, and animal births on the farms where she'd grown up. She understood immediately what was happening. Breech birth, a pup stuck in the birth canal, unable to be expelled, blocking the others that might still be waiting. "Oh, guardian," Margaret breathed. "You need help, don't you? That's why you brought me here." The wolf looked at Margaret with eyes that were glazed with pain and exhaustion, but still conscious, still aware, still trusting. Margaret had saved the guardian's cub weeks ago. Now the guardian was asking her to save the rest of her children. Margaret rolled up her sleeve, said a quick prayer to any god that might be listening, and moved closer. "I'm going to help," she said softly, continuously, speaking more to calm herself than the wolf. "I'm going to help you, girl. I won't hurt you. I promise I won't hurt you." She reached out slowly, telegraphing every movement, and placed her hands on the guardian's swollen belly. The wolf stiffened but didn't snap, didn't pull away. Margaret felt carefully, trying to determine the position of the stuck pup through the layers of fur and muscle skin. There, she could feel it, positioned wrong, unable to be born naturally. What Margaret did next required a courage she didn't know she possessed. With infinite care, working more by feel than sight in the dim den, she reached to help guide the stuck pup. The guardian growled, a deep rumble of pain and warning, but she didn't move, didn't bite. She lay still and let this human, this strange pack member, do what needed to be done. It took perhaps 10 minutes, though it felt like hours. Margaret's hands were covered in blood and birth fluid, her arms shaking with effort and fear. But finally, she felt the pup shift, turn, begin to move. The guardian strained and Margaret supported from outside, and suddenly the pup slipped free into Margaret's waiting hand. It wasn't breathing. Margaret's heart dropped, but instinct took over. She cleared the pup's mouth and nose, rubbed its tiny chest vigorously, and after 3 eternal seconds, the pup gasped and began to cry. The guardian's head came up immediately, and she reached for her newborn with her massive jaws, taking the pup with impossible gentleness and placing it with its siblings to nurse. But they weren't done. Margaret could feel that there were more pups waiting. Over the next hour, as morning light strengthened outside the den, Margaret assisted with 3 more births. 2 came easily now that the breech pup had cleared the way. The third required more help, and by the time it was over, Margaret was exhausted, covered in blood and fluid, her hands cramping from the careful, delicate work, but alive. All the pups were alive, 8 in total, squirming and nursing against their mother's belly. The guardian was exhausted too, panting heavily, but her eyes, when she looked at Margaret, were clear, grateful, proud. "You did so well," Margaret whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Such a good mother, such a strong." The guardian reached out with one massive paw and very deliberately, very carefully placed it on Margaret's hand. A gesture of thanks, a gesture of trust so profound it transcended language. Margaret stayed in the den for another hour, making sure all the pups were nursing properly, making sure the guardian was stable. When she finally emerged back into the daylight, she found not just her own children waiting anxiously, but the entire wolf pack gathered around the den entrance. They parted for her like a living curtain, their eyes following her with something that looked almost like reverence. The pack knew what she had done. They understood that Margaret had saved their alpha's children, had risked herself to help bring new life into the world. Rose ran to Margaret and threw her arms around her mother, heedless of the blood covering her. "Mama, we heard sounds. We were so scared. What happened?" "The guardian had her babies," Margaret said, her voice hoarse from emotion and exhaustion. 8 beautiful pups, and she let me help. She trusted me to help. That trust changed everything. Though Margaret didn't fully understand how much until later that day. She was washing the blood from her hands and arms in the stream when she heard horses, multiple horses, approaching from the southern end of the ravine. Her heart sank even before she saw who it was. Howard Hartley himself, accompanied by Griggs and 3 other men, all armed. Margaret rose slowly from the stream, water dripping from her hands, and faced them. Howard dismounted, his expensive coat and polished boots looking absurdly out of place in the wilderness. His face was red with cold and anger. "Margaret," he said, his voice dripping with false concern, "when Griggs told me you were living out here like an animal, I didn't believe it. But here you are, covered in blood like a savage, raising my brother's children in a train wreck with wild beasts. This has gone on long enough." "Your brother's children are doing fine," Margaret said, keeping her voice level despite her pounding heart. "We're surviving. We're thriving even. We don't need your help or your concern." "Oh, but you do," Howard said, and his smile was vicious. "You see, I've been to Greystone, told folks how you've been living out here with wolves, how you've been filling the children's heads with wild stories about me, about Thomas's death. Folks are concerned, Margaret, concerned that you've gone mad with grief, that you're endangering those children." "That's a lie," Margaret said flatly. "Is it?" Howard pulled a paper from his coat. "This is a court order signed by Judge Morrison. It declares you unfit to care for the children due to mental instability and orders them returned to their family, meaning me, for proper raising." Margaret's world tilted. "You can't. They're my children. They're Hartley," Howard said, "and you're just the widow. The judge agrees that living in a train wreck with wild animals isn't suitable for children. Now you can make this easy or you can make this hard, but either way, Swami, I'm taking them." "No," No, the word came out flat. Absolute. No, you're not. Howard sighed theatrically. I was afraid you'd say that. Boys, go get the children. Griggs and the other men started forward, heading toward the train car where Margaret's children had retreated at the sight of Howard. Margaret moved to block them, but Griggs simply shoved her aside. She fell hard, landing in the half-melted snow, and for one terrible moment, she thought she'd lost. Howard had won. He'd beaten her with laws and courts and money, just like he'd beaten William, just like he'd beaten Thomas. But Howard had forgotten one crucial thing. The Guardian knew betrayal when she saw it, knew violence against Pack when she witnessed it, and she just spent the morning learning exactly how far Margaret would go to protect children. The howl that split the air was like nothing Margaret had ever heard from the Guardian before. It wasn't a call or a warning. It was rage, pure maternal rage from a mother who'd just given birth, who was protective and powerful and absolutely done with threats to her territory. The Guardian erupted from her den entrance like a white avalanche, moving faster than something her size should be able to move. Behind her came the rest of the pack, 6 adult wolves and Ghost, the healed cub, now nearly full grown. They didn't attack, not yet. They simply appeared between Margaret's children and Howard's men, a living wall of fur and teeth and fury. The horses screamed and reared. 2 of Howard's men were thrown immediately. Griggs stumbled backward, falling on his rear in the snow. Howard himself had gone pale, his hand moving toward the gun at his belt. "Don't," Margaret said, getting to her feet. Her voice was steady now, calm, with the certainty of someone who finally understood her own power. "Don't touch that gun, Howard. The Guardian's just given birth. She's protective, she's powerful, and she knows you're threatening her pack." "Your pack?" Howard's voice was shrill with fear and disbelief. "You think you're part of a wolf pack? You have gone insane." "Maybe," Margaret said. "Or maybe I've finally seen clearly. You killed William Brennan. You sabotaged that train 10 years ago for gold you never managed to steal. You killed your own brother with negligence because he documented safety violations. And now you want to take my children, so I can't tell anyone the truth. You have no proof," Howard snarled, but his eyes darted nervously to the wolf. "I have William's journal," Margaret said. "Every detail of your plot written in his own hand. I have the location of the gold you thought was lost. I have testimony about Thomas's death. And I have something else, Howard. I have allies you can't buy, can't threat, can't control." The Guardian took a single step toward Howard. Just one. The same move she'd used with Griggs weeks ago. The meaning was clear. Leave now or face consequences. Howard's men were already backing toward their horse, not waiting for orders. The animals were terrified, eyes rolling, desperate to flee. Griggs was openly crying, scrambling away from the wolves on his hands and knees. "This isn't over," Howard said, but his voice shook. "I'll be back with the law, with real authority." "Then bring them," Margaret said. "Bring the judge. Bring the marshal from Juneau. Bring anyone you want. I'll show them William's journal. I'll show them the gold you tried to steal. I'll tell them about Thomas. And they'll listen, Howard, because I'm not afraid anymore. You can't silence me. You can't make me disappear. I have a voice, and I'm going to use it." Howard mounted his horse, his movements jerky with fear and rage. "You're a fool, Margaret. You think you can fight me? You think wolves and a dead man's scribblings can protect you?" "I don't think," Margaret said quietly. "I know." Howard and his men fled the ravine, the sound of their horses' hooves echoing off the rock wall. When they were gone, when the sound had faded to nothing, Margaret found herself standing alone with the wolf pack surrounding her. The Guardian approached, still cautious from new motherhood, but her amber eyes were warm. "Thank you," Margaret said. "Again, always." The Guardian pressed her massive head against Margaret's hip, and Margaret buried her fingers in the thick white fur, feeling the wolf's warmth, her strength, her absolute loyalty to Pack. When Margaret returned to the train car, she found her children gathered at the door, their faces showing fear and pride in equal measure. Rose was holding baby Samuel, tears streaming down her face. James stood with William's rifle in his hands, positioned like a sentry. The younger ones clustered together, but none of them looked broken. They looked determined. "Is he gone, Mama?" "Oh," Imma asked in her small voice. "For now," Margaret said, "but he'll be back. Men like Howard don't give up easily." "What do we do?" Rose asked. Margaret looked at her 7 children, at the wolves gathered protectively nearby, at the train car that had become their fortress, at the spring sunshine that promised renewal and growth. "We prepare," she said. "We get ready, we gather evidence and allies. And when Howard comes back, we make sure the whole world knows what he's done. We make sure he can never hurt anyone again." That night, as the children slept and the wolf pack settled around the train car in protective positions, Margaret sat with William's journal and began to plan. She had 2 months until the mountain passes would be clear enough travel to Juneau. 2 months to prepare her case, to organize the evidence, to transform from frightened widow to avenging angel. The Guardian's newborn pups cried softly from the den, and Margaret smiled. New life, new beginnings, new possibility. Howard thought he'd won by forcing her out into the wilderness. He had no idea he'd actually given her the key to his destruction. Summer came to the Alaska mountains like a miracle. By June, the ravine had transformed from a frozen wasteland into a landscape shocking beauty. Wildflowers exploded from every patch of exposed earth. Purple lupine, yellow arnicas, delicate white mountain avens. The stream ran full and clear, its music constant and joyful. Trees that had seemed dead all winter burst into vibrant green, and the sun, that pale ghost that had barely shown itself through the dark months now blazed overhead for 20 hours a day, bathing everything in golden light. Margaret stood outside the train car on a morning in late June, watching her children work in the garden they'd planted. It was a strange garden, admittedly, vegetables growing in soil enriched by 4 months of wolf scat and human composting, arranged in neat rows that James had measured out with rope and stakes, but it was thriving. The potatoes William's cache had included were already showing healthy green shoots. The carrots and turnips Rose had planted were sprouting. Even the experimental wheat patch that Margaret had seeded with grain from the very last of their supplies was beginning to show promise. Her children had changed remarkably over the past 4 months. Rose, at 15, was no longer a girl, but a young woman, lean and strong, her face tanned by the sun, her hands capable of skinning game or soothing a crying baby with equal skill. James had shot up several inches and was working on his first real beard, a patchy affair that he was absurdly proud of. The younger children were healthier than they'd ever been. Proper food and outdoor work had transformed them from palomao, sickly things into robust mountain children with bright eyes and endless energy. Even baby Samuel, now 10 months old, was thriving. He was crawling, nearly walking, and had developed an absolute fearlessness around the wolf that gave Margaret minor heart attack, but seemed to delight the pack. Ghost, the healed cub, who was now a gangly adolescent wolf, had appointed himself Samuel's particular guardian, lying patiently while the baby pulled his fur and drooled on his ears. The guardian's new litter had emerged from the den a month ago, 8 tumbling balls of fur that played in the sunshine and learned to hunt under their mother's watchful eye. Margaret had watched them grow with a mother's pride, feeling a connection to them that transcended species. She'd helped birth them. She'd saved some of their lives. They were packed just as surely as her own children were. But today wasn't a day for quiet contemplation of their accomplishments. Today was the day Margaret had been preparing for since Howard's visit in April. Today, Marshal Robert Tucker from Juneau was arriving to hear her testimony about Howard Hartley's crime. Margaret had sent word through a traveling fur trader who'd stumbled upon their ravine in May, shocked to find a widow and 7 children living peacefully among wolves. The trader, a grizzled man named Peterson who'd seen enough of Alaska to take strange things in stride, had agreed to carry Margaret's letter to Juneau along with several pages from William's journal that she'd carefully copied. She'd included the most damning evidence: William's account of the sabotage, his description of Howard's plot, the location of the still hidden gold. Marshal Tucker's reply had come 3 weeks later via Peterson's return trip. He would investigate. He would come to the ravine personally. And if Margaret's evidence was solid, Howard Hartley would face justice for murder and theft. Margaret had spent the intervening weeks preparing. She'd organized every page of William's journal, marking the crucial passages. She'd drawn maps showing exactly where in the train car the gold was hidden. She'd written out her own testimony about Thomas's death, about the tunnel that had accidentally collapsed just days after Thomas had documented safety violations. She'd even practiced what she would say, how she would present the case, anticipating every argument Howard might make in his defense. Rose appeared at her elbow, breaking Margaret's concentration. "Mama, there's someone coming from the South Trail." Margaret's heart began to hammer. "Just one person? One horse, I think, but Mama..." Rose's voice dropped to a whisper. "The Guardian's watching. The whole pack is on alert." Margaret hurried to the southern end of the ravine and looked up. Sure enough, a rider was making his way down the steep trail, a difficult descent that required full attention. But what caught Margaret's eye was the ring of wolves positioned on the ridgeline above him. 6 adults and 8 juveniles, all sitting in plain sight, all watching the stranger with focused intensity. The rider was a big man, perhaps 50, with gray in his beard and a star pinned to his coat. Marshal Tucker, arriving exactly when he'd promised. But as he navigated the treacherous trail, he kept glancing up at the wolves, his expression showing understandable wariness. "Guardian!" Margaret called out. Using the voice she'd learned, the alpha wolf responded, "Palma. It's all right, he's here to help." The great white wolf looked at Margaret, then back at the marshal, then seemed to make a decision. She stood and trotted down the slope, passing close enough to the marshal's horse to make it shy nervously, then positioned herself near Margaret. A statement: "This human is pack, and pack protects each other." Marshal Tucker reached the ravine floor and dismounted, his hand resting on his sidearm but not drawing it. His eyes took in everything: the train car, the garden, the children watching from safe positions, the wolves, and Margaret herself, standing straight and unafraid with the massive ghost wolf at her side. "Mrs. Hartley, I presume." His voice was a deep rumble, surprisingly gentle for such a large man. "Marshal Tucker, thank you for coming." Margaret extended her hand, and after a moment's hesitation, the marshal shook it. His grip was firm, his palm calloused. A working man's hand, not a politician. "I'll be honest, ma'am, when I got your letter, I thought it was some kind of hoax. A widow living in the ghost train with children and wolves." He shook his head. "Figured you were either crazy or lying, but Peterson vouched for you, said he'd seen it with his own eyes. And those journal pages you sent." He paused, his eyes serious. "If they're genuine, we're talking about multiple murders, Mrs. Hartley. That's not something I take lightly. They're genuine, or Margaret said. Come inside, I'll show you everything. Over the next 3 hours, Margaret laid out the case against Howard Hartley. She showed Marshall Tucker the complete journal, watching as the lawman read William's increasingly desperate entries, his description of the sabotage, his certainty about Howard's guilt. She showed him her own documentation of Thomas's death, the timing that was too convenient, the safety reports that had disappeared. She told him about Howard's threats, about the attempt to take her children, about a pattern of violence and corruption that stretched back more than a decade. And the gold? Marshall Tucker asked. William's journal says it's still here? It is, Margaret confirmed. I haven't touched it. I wanted an official witness when it was recovered. Together, they opened the hidden compartment in the train car's floor. The marshal's eyes widened when he saw the gold ingots, each one still bearing the Alaska Mining Company seal. He picked one up, tested its weight, examined the stamp. This is official company gold, he said slowly. Part of the shipment that was supposed to be on that train. Howard Hartley reported it lost in the crash, collected insurance on it, wrote it off as a total loss. He looked at Margaret with new respect. If this was here all along, if he knew it was here and claimed it was destroyed, that's fraud on top of murder. Can you arrest him? Margaret asked, hardly daring to hope. I can, Marshall Tucker said, and I will. But Mrs. Hartley, you need to understand, this isn't going to be easy. Howard Hartley is a powerful man. He's got friends in territorial government, owns half the judges in this part of Alaska. Even with this evidence, he's going to fight. He's going to drag your name through the mud, question your sanity, use every trick he knows to avoid justice. Let him try, Margaret said quietly. I'm not the desperate widow he threw out anymore, Marshall. I've survived 4 months in these mountains with 7 children. I've made peace with wolves. I've birthed wolf pups and hunted for meat and built a life from nothing. Howard doesn't scare me anymore. Marshall Tucker studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. I believe you, ma'am. And for what it's worth, I think William Brennan would be proud. He tried to stop Howard 10 years ago and failed. Maybe you'll succeed where he couldn't. The marshal stayed overnight, sleeping by the fire in the train car while Margaret and the children bedded down in their usual spots. In the morning, he helped Margaret carefully pack the gold ingots in the most important pages of William's journal into saddlebags. The plan was for Margaret to travel with him to Juneau, to give testimony in person, to see the case through to its conclusion. What about the children? Rose asked, fear evident in her voice. We can't all travel to Juneau. You'll stay here, Margaret said, taking her daughter's hands. You, James, and the others. You know how to survive now. You have the garden, the supplies, the wolves. The wolves, Marshall Tucker interjected, his eyebrows raised. The guardian will watch over them, Margaret said with absolute certainty. She protected this place for 10 years, waiting for someone to find William's legacy. She'll protect my children while I'm gone. And as if to confirm Margaret's words, the great white wolf appeared at that moment, her 8 pups tumbling along behind her. She approached the group of humans and deliberately positioned herself between the children and the marshal, making her allegiance clear. Marshall Tucker shook his head in wonder. In 20 years of law enforcement, I've seen some strange things, but this might top them all. Margaret spent the next hour preparing for departure. She held each of her children, giving them instructions and reassurance in equal measure. Rose was put in charge as eldest, with James as her second. Catherine and William were responsible for the garden. Emma would care for Samuel. Even little Michael had his job, keeping the fire going, never letting it die. How long will you be gone, Mama? Emma asked, clinging to Margaret's shirts. A month, maybe less, Margaret said, hoping it was true. The summer days are long now. The marshal and I can travel fast. I'll testify, Howard will be arrested, and I'll come home to you. Promise? Emma's eyes were brimming with tears. I promise, Margaret said and mained it. She'd survived too much, fought too hard to fail now. The journey to Juneau took 5 days of hard riding. Marshall Tucker proved to be good company, with a dry sense of humor and a wealth of stories from his years in law enforcement. He asked Margaret about her life with the wolves, and she found herself describing the past 4 months in detail. The desperate early days, the discovery of William's cache, the gradual building of trust with the guardian, the birth of the pups. You know people are gonna think you're crazy, the marshal said as they made camp on the 3rd night. Living with wolves, talking about them like their family. The judge will use that against you. Let them think what they want, Margaret said. I know what I've lived. I know what's true. Juneau was overwhelming after months in the wilderness. The noise, the people, the buildings, it all pressed in on Margaret, making her long for the quiet of her ravine. But she steeled herself and followed Marshall Tucker to the territorial courthouse, where her testimony was scheduled for the following morning. The trial, if it could be called that, lasted 3 days. Howard Hartley arrived with 2 expensive lawyers from Seattle, men in fine suits who spoke in elaborate sentences designed to confuse and obfuscate. They attacked Margaret's character, questioned her sanity, suggested that grief had driven her mad, and that she'd fabricated evidence against a respectable businessman out of spite. But Margaret stood firm. She spoke clearly and calmly, presenting William's journal, explaining the evidence, describing Howard's threats. When Howard's lawyers tried to dismiss the journal as fake, she pointed out details that only the actual conductor of that train would have known. Cargo manifests, schedule information, the names of company officials. When they suggested she'd forged it herself, she asked them to explain how she'd known about the hidden gold that had just been recovered. And when Howard himself took the stand, smug and confident, confident, claiming that his poor sister-in-law had been driven mad by grief and wilderness living. Margaret played her final card. "Your Honor," she said, standing up in the courtroom, "I'd like to call a witness who can speak to Howard Hartley's character, someone who worked with him directly, who knew about his business practice." "This is highly irregular," Howard's lead lawyer protested. "The witness list was—" "The witness is already here," Margaret said. "Mr. Peterson, the fur trader who delivered my letter to Marshal Tucker. He's been in Alaska for 30 years. He's traded with every mining camp between here and the Yukon. And he has stories about Howard Hartley's operations that I think the court needs to hear." What Peterson revealed over the next hour was damning. Stories of miners who disappeared after reporting safety violations, of tunnels that had collapsed with suspicious frequency, of widows who'd been forced out with nothing, their husbands' final wages mysteriously lost in paperwork, of workers who'd complained about conditions and found themselves blacklisted from every mine in the territory. None of it was concrete proof of murder, but it was a pattern, a clear, unmistakable pattern of a man who valued gold over human life, who silenced problems permanently, who operated with impunity because he was rich and powerful and no one had ever been brave enough to challenge him. The judge, a territorial appointee from Washington, not one of Howard's local allies, listened to it all with an increasingly stern expression. When Peterson finished, when Howard's lawyers had exhausted their objections and cross-examination, the judge called for a recess. The verdict came the next morning. Howard Hartley was found guilty of fraud in the matter of the falsely reported gold loss. The murder charges couldn't stick. William's journal was compelling, but it wasn't enough to prove murder beyond reasonable doubt a decade after the fact. But the fraud was ironclad. The gold had been recovered. Howard had reported it lost and collected insurance. That was a crime, and it carried a penalty. 5 years in territorial prison, forfeiture of all mining assets, a fine of $50,000. It wasn't everything Margaret had hoped for. Howard wouldn't hang for William's murder, wouldn't face justice for Thomas's death, but it was something. It was a victory. It was the first time anyone had ever held Howard Hartley accountable for his actions. As Howard was led away in chains, he looked at Margaret with such pure hatred that she felt it like a physical blow. But she met his eyes steadily, without flinching, and watched until he disappeared from sight. Marshal Tucker walked Margaret back to the boarding house where she'd been staying. "What will you do now, Mrs. Hartley? You've got the gold from the train car. That's legally yours now, since William had no heirs and you found it. That's enough money to buy a house in town, set up a proper life for your children." Margaret thought about that. A house in town, neighbors, school, safety, everything she'd once desperately wanted. And then she thought about the ravine, the train car that had become home, the garden her children had planted, the wolves who'd become family, the life they'd built from nothing but determination and hope. "I'm going back," she said simply. "Back to my children, back to the mountain. To live with wolves?" The marshal's voice wasn't judgmental, just curious. "To live free," Margaret corrected. "To live on land where no Howard Hartley can tell me I don't belong. To raise my children, strong and willed and unafraid. That's what William's legacy gave me. Not just gold, but freedom." The journey back to the ravine took another 5 days. Margaret traveled alone this time, the gold in William's journal safe in her saddlebag, her heart pulling her homeward with every mile. As she finally descended the familiar trail into the ravine, as she saw the train car glinting in the summer sun, she heard a sound that made her throat tight with emotion. Howling, the Guardian's unmistakable voice calling to the pack, announcing the return of a pack member. Margaret's children poured out of the train car, running toward her with shouts of joy. Rose reached her first, throwing her arms around her mother and sobbed. Then James, then all of them, a tangle of hugging and crying and laughing children. Even baby Samuel, held in Catherine's arms, reached for his mother with pudgy hands. And standing at a respectful distance, waiting her turn, was the Guardian. When the children finally released Margaret, when they stepped back to let her breathe, the great white wolf approached. She pressed her massive head against Margaret's hip, the same gesture of affection and trust she'd made months ago, and Margaret buried her fingers in the thick fur. "I'm home," Margaret whispered. "We won. We really won." That night, as Margaret sat with her children around the fire and told them everything that had happened in Juneau, she pulled out William's journal one final time. She'd made the decision during the long ride home, and now she acted on it. She opened to the last page where William's final entry ended and began to write. "July 1895. My name is Margaret Hartley. I found this journal 4 months ago when I was desperate and lost. William Brennan's words saved my life and the lives of my 7 children. His kindness to a wolf 10 years ago created a legacy of protection that sheltered us when we had nowhere else to turn. His documentation of Howard Hartley's crimes helped bring a criminal to justice. I want anyone who finds this journal in the future to know William Brennan was a good man. He died trying to stop evil, and though he didn't succeed in his own lifetime, his words lived on to accomplish what he could not. He saved us across the span of a decade, and we will honor his memory by living well, by teaching our children kindness and courage, by protecting those who need protection. The Guardian still watches over this place. She's old now, gray in her muzzle, but still strong, still devoted to the memory of the man who showed her kindness when she was young. Her children and grandchildren run these mountains. They've learned from her that not all humans are threats, that some two-legged creatures can be trusted, can be packed. We're staying staying here, this train car, this ravine, this territory. It's our home now. We'll plant gardens and hunt game and raise children and wolves side by side. We'll prove that there are different ways to live, different kinds of family, different definitions of civilization. Thank you, William, for your kindness, for your courage, for not giving up even when dying. You saved us all. May anyone who reads these words learn what I learned, that the most terrifying places sometimes hold the greatest safety, that the creatures everyone fears might be the truest friend, that kindness echoes across time, creating ripples we can't predict, but that change everything. We are the Ghost Wolves pack. We are William Brennan's legacy. We are alive and free and home. Margaret closed the journal and placed it carefully back in its protective wrap. Tomorrow she would hide it again in the train car's secret compartment, along with some gold and supplies, a cache for some future desperate soul who might need it, just as she had needed William's gift. Outside, the summer sun was finally setting, painting the ravine in shades of gold and purple. The Guardian's howl rose into the twilight, and this time Margaret's children joined in, not howling themselves, but calling out in their own voices, a chorus of human and wolf sound mixing together in the mountain air. Margaret stood at the train car's door and looked out at her life, her 7 children, healthy and strong, her wolf, peaceful and protective, her garden growing toward harvest, her freedom, hard-won and precious beyond gold. She'd been thrown out to die and had found a way to live, had been stripped of everything and had built everything anew, had lost the husband she loved and had gained a family that transcended species. The ghost train wasn't cursed. It was blessed. It was home. And Margaret Hartley, once a powerless widow, was now the matriarch of the strangest, strongest family the Alaska mountains had ever known. The howling continued as darkness fell, and Margaret smiled. They were packed. They were home. They were free. And that was worth more than all the gold in Alaska.